We would like to get started, please. Thank you. The last topic for this conference is the environment, and the author of the paper is Alan Springer, professor at the Department of Government and Legal Studies at Bowdoin College, and his title is From Trail Smelter to Devil's Lake: The Need for Effective Federal Involvement in Canadian-U.S. Environmental Disputes.
Great. Thank you very much, Dee Dee. I also want to thank the Center for inviting me, and I have to make particular thanks to Dave Biette for having me here. One of the things I have to thank him for is that he looks so incredibly young, because he's a former student of mine, and it's very nice to see somebody here who looks so well preserved. I also have to thank him because with the invitation to come here, I had an opportunity to get back into a world that on some level I hadn't addressed for some time. I've been involved in U.S. and Canadian environmental relations for some time, but like a lot of people who've been working in this area, I increasingly was working on the state and provincial level. I was very much interested, as I do come from the Gulf of Maine area, about the things that had happened in there at that world. Because of fisheries concerns, I was interested in the Pacific salmon dispute, but I really hadn't focused enough on some of the other bilateral issues that are out there. And I'm actually engaged right now in a broader project on transboundary environmental dispute settlement that really is very much outside of the North American context. And for me, an opportunity to get back to really what was the root of my concern for all of this was really very exciting. So I am here today just to talk a little bit about one angle of this, and I want to emphasize that this is really only one dimension of this whole world of transboundary dispute management, and that is the potential role for federal governments in that process. To some extent, it is, again, kind of a shift from what a lot of people have been focusing on, as increasingly, I think, for a variety of reasons, very many of them sort of tied to the specifics of individual disputes, the emphasis has tended to shift away from the role of federal governments. And if you find people in Maine or on the West Coast, and I'm sure in the upper Midwest as well, talking suspiciously about the role of federal governments, it's often this sense that they're too distant, they're too disengaged, they have other issues that are more important to them, and that the people who are most affected by these decisions ought to be the ones really controlling what happens. And while I have some sympathy to that, I also have a sense that there are some limitations to the perspective that can be brought to bear on those issues simply by those people closest to the issues involved. And because my own training, though not as a lawyer, is in the world of international law and diplomacy, I've always had a certain sensitivity to the role of the federal governments, and particularly the diplomatic branches of the federal government, in addressing issues that often, for very good reasons, many would prefer not to address. The United States and Canada have a very long, complicated bilateral relationship, which, as we've talked about today, encompasses a number of issues, and there could be some very genuine desires to talk about these sort of environmental things more locally. But I think there are times, and that's really what the point of my paper is, where it's important for federal governments to get involved, and not just to get involved, but to get involved in a timely way. Because some disputes, avoided, managed, over time can become more serious. And I think there is not only a role for federal governments, but if I can say in very traditional background that I have, there's also a role for law, even international law, in helping us manage this relationship. Now, my paper is not trying to suggest that this is the only way we should approach these things, and this is certainly not a call for, some sort of mandatory arbitration process to resolve all the transboundary environmental issues that we face. Back in the 70s, I know that the American and Canadian Bar Associations were putting forward a couple of models for transboundary dispute settlement that would have put an awful lot of emphasis on formal litigation. My own work, really outside of the U.S.-Canadian context, tries to talk about international law in a broader way, focusing less on this sort of formal application of law through binding third-party settlement. I would argue in the U.S.-Canadian context it does have a place. I believe that as difficult it was and as controversial as it was, the Gulf of Maine boundary delimitation in 1984 was a very important step in getting Canada and the United States to confront some issues in that part of the world, not always confronting them effectively, as we in Maine certainly know. There are fisheries and other issues that weren't effectively resolved by drawing a boundary between Canada and the United States there, but I honestly don't think we could have made much progress on those issues without doing that first. And there are times times when even formal adjudicative proceedings can be important, recognizing that we have a long shared boundary with a lot of disputes that cut both ways. And there is a reciprocity in this relationship that the federal governments have to recognize, and I think do recognize. What the United States may assert in the case of Devil's Lake is something that we have to be aware of coming back in another context along the border. So again, I think there's reason for the federal governments to play a role. I also recognize that there's a problem. I also recognize that there are many who see the intrusion of law into this relationship as what I refer to in the paper here as primitive thinking, that somehow the United States and Canada have developed this mature bilateral relationship where law is intrusive. But again, I think it's modeled so much on this idea that we resolve our problems in courts, when a lot of it to me is conducting our discussions even bilaterally using the language of the rules that not only exist, but I would argue I think could be developed more fully. And I think it's particularly important in a transboundary context where people in Manitoba and North Dakota see things in a very narrow perspective, where you need the breadth of perspective I think that the federal governments can provide. Okay, quickly on the Devil's Lake dispute, and some of you here probably know much more about this than I. It's a little obnoxious for somebody from the Gulf of Maine to be talking about prairie issues and an academic at that. And so what I really want to suggest here is that there are interesting issues posed by the Devil's Lake dispute. Effectively what we're dealing with here is a proposal to divert waters from a lake that really has no natural outlet and which was becoming increasingly polluted, where flooding problems in North Dakota were a very real and serious concern to the people of North Dakota. 80,000 acres were being flooded, hundreds of millions of dollars of damage were being done, and even Canadians who may have resented the project that was being developed recognized this to be an issue. The problem was that the only apparent way of dealing with was to divert a lot of the waters out of Devil's Lake into waters of the Cheyenne River, which would run into the Red River, forming the boundary between North Dakota and Minnesota, and then traveling into Manitoba, ultimately making their way into the Hudson Bay watershed. There were two major concerns, one with the level of pollutants in the water. The second concern had to do with biotic transfer, that alien species or parasites that were present in Devil's Lake might make their way into this transboundary water system. Overarching all of this in many ways was that this had been part of a much earlier and much broader project known as the Garrison Diversion, which again many of you may know an awful lot about. A very controversial project which probably died more on the American side of the border because of American political issues than because of Canadian concerns, but where the International Joint Commission had been very much involved and issued a pretty critical report about the possible implications of that. It created a world in which the dispute was undoubtedly going to be very difficult. Now, I can't go into the details of the dispute. It's a very long and complicated story. I would argue that it really came to a head in 2003. I mean, and again, discussions had been going on since the early 70s about various aspects of the proposal. But it was in that year that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers proposed an outlet from Devil's Lake funded by federal money that would take this water across the border eventually into Manitoba and Lake Winnipeg. The project was an ambitious one of about $200 million, and it included an advanced filtration system that, as the Army Corps of Engineers reviewed it, subject to subsequent review by the State Department, which turned it back to the EPA and others to review the transboundary effect, seemed, from the perspective of the United States, to deal responsively with the primary Canadian concerns. The problem came in part from the fact of the delay that was built into the project, the cost that it was going to impose on the state of North Dakota, which was a good deal more than an alternative project that the state was developing on its own. In the meantime, the state literally went ahead and began digging this channel, this second outlet from a different part of Devil's Lake, arguing in part that the assurances that the Secretary of State had given that this wouldn't hurt Canada was consistent with their own project as well. There was a very bitter two-year battle that went on over this, and in 2000, and it involved a number of very interesting and complicated NGOs and others. And I should point out that this is not simply a Canada versus U.S. issue. There were a lot of people, particularly in Minnesota, who didn't like the idea of this project anyway, which arguably may be one of the reasons why the U.S. was as willing to be as concerned about Canadian interests as it was. But the United States, throughout this dispute at the federal level, made clear that it understood that the 1909 Boundary Waters Treaty was relevant, that we had a duty to protect Canadian interests, and the question was really how best to do that. And a lot of this issue, I would argue, was as much procedural as anything else. How do you go about, through the impact assessment process, through the consultation process, to make sure that those interests are taken into account? Again, it became a very acrimonious battle, as many of you may know, between Manitoba and North Dakota, threats of economic sanctions, nasty editorials going back and forth the border, a lot of pressure put on the Canadian federal government to intercede on Manitoba's behalf at the highest levels with President Bush, direct bilateral discussions between them. The bottom line was that in 2005, a temporary agreement was reached. That agreement, in effect, I would argue, deferred a lot of the serious long-term questions about water development in the region, but helped the two countries at the time kind of muddle through and set in motion a process for trying to get some sort of agreement on an advanced filtration system. And in that sense, it was a very positive thing. On the other hand, it seemed to me that it took a long time to get us not very far in terms of dealing with the Devil's Lake dispute. And very shortly afterwards, it became clear that NGOs weren't satisfied, as NGO groups, in fact, brought a claim before the NAFTA CEC, arguing that both Canada and the United States had failed to respect the terms of the Boundary Waters Treaty. And folks in Manitoba were very upset, particularly when they saw the project going ahead without this new advanced filtration system being put into effect. And then, when North Dakota, as part of its own permit process system, allowed water to be brought in, at least in theory, and to be dumped into the Cheyenne River with higher sulfate levels than would have been the case under the original permit. It's a complicated issue, but so there was ongoing unhappiness about all of this. And it's an issue that to this day has not been resolved, although apparently agreement has been made on the filtration system. It's a difficult dispute, and I'd be happy to try to talk about it more in detail, but let me just suggest a couple of really conclusions about all of this in terms of what this suggests to me, both about the Devil's Lake dispute and also some broader questions involving the U.S.-Canadian relationship. It seems to me that what is positive about this is that, at least at the federal level, I believe the United States government took its international legal responsibilities seriously under the Boundary Waters Treaty. We had said, going back to the time of the Garrison diversion, that Canada had legitimate interests that needed to be recognized, and that we were committed to doing that. And when the first Army Corps of Engineer impact study came out, it was clear that the State Department did not believe that those interests were adequately taken into account. Later on, they received some assurances with which I'm sure many Canadians might have disagreed, but at least it seems to me that they took that process seriously. The treaty was very much the focus of discussion. Even the North Dakota officials who wanted to go ahead argued that what they were doing was consistent with the treaty. And I also think that the Canadian federal government behaved about as responsibly as it could in the face of the refusal by the United States to send the matter to the International Joint Commission. They lobbied heavily. They lobbied on many levels to try to get people in the United States to encourage the State Department to take it that route. But I think they also responsibly did not try, as I guess at least a few had suggested, to take the matter to the IJC as a unilateral reference, because for a lot of reasons having to do with our shared interests and reciprocity along the border, I think that would have been a mistake. On the other hand, the degree of independence that North Dakota exhibited in all of this is a source of concern, and the inability of the State Department, at some point somebody was saying something about we might have to send in the Marines, the inability of the State Department effectively to control a project that, even from the State Department perspective, it appears they had concerns about its transboundary effects, was a source of concern. I think the ICJ should have been brought in more quickly. I think this is a problem. Part of it may be a procedural issue in terms of how quickly the IJC operates, but at various times both countries had thought about taking it to the IJC, and figuring out a way to bring it in earlier, it seems to me, would have been helpful. Something like joint impact assessment, which has been proposed, might be a way of dealing with some of the problems in these transboundary boundary disputes. What I don't think is going to resolve the problem is what I've heard too often suggested, and that is that we simply open up the procedures in Manitoba, open up the procedures in North Dakota, and make them be more both accessible to outsiders and more aware of transboundary effects. Transboundary disputes, by their very nature, have a disproportionate share of costs and benefits. There's very little gained in Manitoba, and there's something to be gained in North Dakota. And unless you have a broader perspective that puts this dispute in the context of all the other ones we have, I think you have a problem. Now, I'm not coming here with any specific recommendations, particularly since my time is up, but I'm happy to discuss it because I think it's a problem that deserves addressing by the federal as well as local governments.
Thank you, Allan. Sigrid Johnson is the discussant for this paper. She is Councillor and Head of the Environment and Fisheries section at the Embassy of Canada. Sigrid.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank you, Allan, for a very good paper, which I found very interesting, and to the Woodrow Wilson Center for having this event, because it's very unusual for a bureaucrat who's working day to day on usually emergency issues to have the time to reflect on different alternatives to addressing such issues, perhaps more strategically, but most importantly to looking back at what has been done in the past and perhaps trying to pull in some of that knowledge to apply it to those current urgencies that keep us occupied every day. I'll start out by pointing out that I'm not a lawyer, as neither is Allan, but neither do I have the experience of all his legal training. So I am somewhat limited in responding specifically to much of the legal context of his paper. I've been a diplomat for 16 years, and during that time I've worked on issues as diverse as South African policy, Russian policy, and most recently in Canada's Privy Council Office, which is the bureaucratic arm of the Prime Minister's office. I'm very happy to be in Washington heading our Environment and Fisheries program because 16 years ago, longer than that, I actually started out in the environment field working on national parks management, spending 3 years in Malawi, working for the Malawi Department of National Parks and Wildlife, and then in Canada's high Arctic. So there is a little bit of environmental background that I come to this current job that I have, and I bring that perspective with me, as well as those years of general diplomatic experience, and particularly working at the Privy Council Office, where your job is to look at all issues in a very broad context and try and consider the implication for each federal government department, as well as the bilateral relationship. As I said earlier, I found Dr. Springer's paper very interesting, very well researched on a whole broad range of Canada-U.S. interests. Specifically, in the one that was of interest most to me was Devil's Lake, because that's an issue that has played a huge role in the 2 years that I've been here at the embassy. I was very impressed with his research and his contacts. He clearly has some very good inside the Beltway contacts, because his perspective was right on in most instances. The bottom line is that I actually agree pretty much with everything he has said in his paper, which doesn't leave me a lot of room for having any kind of a great discussion, but I will attempt to at least highlight a few of the points that he's raised and perhaps add a few additional comments. First of all, it's certainly in the environment and fisheries sector, it is very much federal policy to try and allow issues to be identified and dealt with at the regional or local level first. When you look at the broad range of issues that we have, and I'll get up and run through them on a daily basis. For example, on the Devil's Lake, Manitoba and North Dakota cooperate and deal with each other on a whole range of issues every day where they have very good relationships. And then there are occasionally some where they don't have very good relationships. Because the Manitobans go shopping in North Dakota, the North Dakotans go shopping in Manitoba, I mean, the contacts are all there. So it makes sense that when an issue is identified, that they try and deal with them first at the local level, because those are the people who have the most emotional attachment to the results of whatever the solution will be. Canada is trying to, or the federal government is trying as much as possible to support further development of regional and local mechanisms. They're particularly useful in bringing in the whole range of stakeholders, including the local NGOs who may not know about or have access to higher level, going to the Commission on Environmental Cooperation, or don't have the resources to launch litigation in the U.S. So regional mechanisms are very useful for broadening the number of voices that can be included in any discussion of finding a solution to regional environment fisheries challenges. The one challenge that these regional organizations face, of course, when they're working so much at the local level, is maintaining their scientific and, I guess, ethical non-bias. It's very hard when it's people you know who are emotional about the issue and are putting pressure on you, and it's very important in environment and fisheries to try and ensure that the best scientific knowledge is always brought to play, and that politics aren't allowed to become the dominating feature. I'll just quickly run through the issues on the map. I'm sorry you can't see it very well, but you can get up and have a look at it later if it interests you. It just helps give you an idea of, apart from the Tecominco and the Devil's Lake issues raised in his paper, the kind of stuff we deal with on a daily basis and that we have to consider when we look at any one issue. So the Canada-U.S. land and water boundary is about 5,500 miles total. And so you can imagine there's a lot of stuff that can happen because of all the air and the water and the wildlife and the fish and marine resources that go back and forth and ignore the border. The water doesn't always flow south. Sometimes it flows north. And I would also like to point out that while Canadians like to think of themselves as a very green nation, equally the Americans, I spend time working with the Americans on issues where it's the Canadians have done something to the detriment, or planning to do something that may be to the detriment of Americans too. Neither country is squeaky clean on managing environment and fisheries issues. So at the top of the map in the north we have the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which Didi is very familiar about, and from her numerous years living in Anchorage and working with Alaskans. We also have Dawson Sewage. On the Canadian side of the border, the city of Dawson doesn't have sewage treatment facilities, and the sewage effluent is put into a river that crosses the border and in fact is a salmon stream. So the U.S. is very concerned about the fact that so far there is no sewage treatment facility in Dawson City. Tecumseh Chief Mine, the Taku River in the border of BC and Alaska is another issue. Again, it's a salmon river and a potential mine development. We have a number of vessels, U.S. Vessels that have been sunk in Canadian waters, which were carrying toxic substances when they went down, and it's a question of trying to get the U.S. federal government to remove or at least mitigate the effluents which are contaminating local resources. Great Bear Rainforest, or the Coastal Incentive Initiative in British Columbia. This is a very interesting issue where it's been American philanthropists who have raised a huge amount of money to try and support economic development in British Columbia, which includes the area where the white spirit bear lives. So the Canadian-American bilateral context is that Canadian federal government has not yet been able to come up with its share to contribute towards this very extensive, took 10 years to negotiate, economic regional development project, including a lot of First Nations communities, but the U.S. private sector has come up with an enormous amount of money that they are suggesting that the Canadian federal government, because it's in Canadian lands, might want to consider funding as well. One of the issues we used to have to deal with, which sadly is off the agenda now, is Luna the whale. I don't know if anybody was familiar with the issue of Luna the whale, who had been, as a youngster, was stranded from her pod. The pod goes up and down on the west coast, and it became a bilateral issue because a senator from Washington, the pod spends part of the year off Washington, and they wanted Luna to be reunited with the pod, and Department of Fisheries and Oceans in Canada tried their best to make this happen on the day they were going to try and encourage Luna to go out when they knew the pod was passing by. The local First Nations rallied their canoes and prevented this from happening because Luna had arrived the day after their chief had died, and he had told people that he would come back in the form of a whale, so they viewed Luna as the reincarnation of their chief. Dispute, challenges, management concerns continued for 2 years until, sadly, earlier this year, Luna was sucked into the propeller of a boat and killed. So that is one issue which has left our bilateral agenda. Victoria sewage, again, we have a situation where we have a lovely Canadian city which pumps their sewage directly into the water, and of course that influences directly across the bay there. Tekkaminko, the paper referred to what is often used as one of the key examples in international environmental law, which is the Tekkaminko air quality smelter issue. But the issue that I deal with on a daily basis is the fact that the Tekkaminko smelter and trail for over 100 years dumped the slag from their trail facility into the Columbia River, and it was transported downstream, and the impacts remain there today, and that's the subject of a great deal of litigation and attempt at cooperation and consensus between the two governments. Flathead River, that's an issue where the government of British Columbia wants to develop, do some further mining, and there is concern that, again, the impacts will be felt downstream in Montana. The St. Mary Milk Rivers, this is a long-term issue that's been dealt with under the International Joint Commission for many years. It's a river that winds back and forth across the Canada-U.S. border. It's a question of apportionment, meaning the farmers who use that water for irrigation, they have, if they take water out of the stream upstream to do their irrigation, there's less water downstream for the other farmers, sometimes which are on the other side of the border. So for many years we've been dealing with that. Quickly to finish, we also have obviously all you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stickers for North Dakota water issues. Various, including Lake of the Woods. They may at some point consider Lake of the Woods. We have sewage from Sault Ste. Marie. We have waste. Unfortunately, the province of Ontario ships most of its waste to Michigan, and that doesn't go over well with the Michigan voters. Continuing on up through other various IJC water issues, the St. John sewage, Halifax sewage, there's a theme here with sewage, and fisheries issues largely concerning Machias Seal Island, the lobster population. The one thing I would stress is that Canada-U.S. environmental issues are pretty much subject to politics. As much as we may have some good international treaties in place and agreements, which we try and strengthen on a regular basis, such as the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, which is currently being reviewed by both Canada and the U.S. to attempt to ensure that it continues to do what it's supposed to do, politics interferes. And the U.S. election system contributes to that greatly. The fact that there's an election every 2 years and that the day after the election you're preparing for the next election again means that representatives and senators, governors are very vulnerable to the wants and the emotions of their voters. In Canada, in Manitoba, for example, on Devil's Lake, it tends to be, it's generally every 4 or 5 years. In our current minority government situation, it tends to be a little more frequent, but we do tend to be a little less susceptible to the influence of politics on our everyday attempt to manage under what should be a good, firm legislative basis for managing our relationships. We try and, I was the lead of the Devil's Lake Advocacy Campaign we did in August 2005, where we had been told explicitly by the State Department that there was never going to be resolution of this until we bumped it up and could get American voters telling that their key officials in the U.S. administration that it was a concern to them, and therefore them, the voters, Canadians don't vote here, and therefore they should take action on it. And we were, I must say, I would say almost alarmingly shocked at how effective that campaign was. Unfortunately, the State Department, who had suggested the idea, it then came back to haunt them, and we haven't been very popular with them ever since because it was such an effective campaign. But that is how we try in many ways to deal with our transboundary issues, is to identify the U.S. interests and educate them, or at least suggest how it might be a concern to them, not so much to Canadians, and then have them lobby their own government. I would say in summary after that despite the legal framework, it is politics which plays the biggest role in the management of our local issues. We look for other mechanisms. We have a couple we're trying to develop now, something called the Security and Prosperity Partnership, which was, it's trilateral, and it was an idea of President Fox, President Bush, and President Prime Minister Martin, thank you. They change fairly quickly in Canada, which has an environmental component, including a transboundary environmental impact assessment component. We also have a new initiative identified by President Bush and President Harper, an Energy and Environment Task Force. So again, there's an awareness that we need to find better ways to deal with these issues, and even if they're a bureaucratic analysis of the mechanisms we already have and where we have the weaknesses, it is forefront in the federal government's mind, and we are aware that we need to come up with better ways to deal with the politics.
Thank you, Sigrid. Allan, would you
Yeah,
like
I'll
to
be very
respond?
quick because I know there are many who would like to speak. First of all, I couldn't agree more with the comments that you made, particularly about the impact of politics on all of this. And I've tried to be very clear in the paper that there's no way that any kind of legal framework or set of legal rules is going to remove the politics from the process. I think the question is whether legal frameworks, legal understandings can help structure the political discussion in such a way that we focus on the most important issues and not those which often grab the headlines most quickly. And that's not an easy process. And it's also something that I've suggested in the paper, really one has to be sensitive about on different jurisdictions. How this plays out in Canada is going to be quite different than how this is going to play in the United States, just because there are different federal relationships and different regulatory traditions. But I still, again, would argue that law can be brought into the process in a way that too much, I think, it's just simply been excluded from it, and I think we need creative ways to do that. The other comment, well, and a quick comment about what I still refer to as the Trail Smelter case, because an international lawyer has to do that. It's also a classic example of how adjudication doesn't necessarily resolve all problems, since it was decided in 1941, and it's now still an ongoing issue between the two of us. So I would not suggest that that's going to deal with everything we have to do. The other thing is simply in terms of the impact of regionalism. I couldn't agree more about one of the virtues of regionalism being its ability, for the most part, to involve often non-state actors, what we sometimes refer to as stakeholders, those people who really do feel excluded from almost any public process. Even the IJC can try to do its best to open itself up to public participation, but for a lot of people that simply isn't a very effective avenue. And having worked for a long time on the Gulf of Maine Council work, I have seen the extent to which it has been crucial in bringing often very small local organizations into doing some very important things like trying to clean up marine debris in Portland Harbor. I also know, knowing a lot of Maine fishermen, that there is very little interest in transferring many fisheries issues onto the federal level any more than they absolutely have to, and that there is good reason for that. I understand that, and they have a closeness to that resource that it sometimes distorts their perspective. On the other hand, gives them a very real stake that any attempt to federalize that process too much, I think, would be a mistake. So, again, thank you for your comments, and I look forward to yours.
Yes, Joe.
Joe Duckert. I welcome any opportunity to link energy and environment because I think they ought to be talked about together more often. I'd like to give two examples of federal, state, or provincial or federal regional arrangements in energy that parallel the questions that you have raised in your paper. First of all, there's something called the North American Electric Reliability Council, which dates back many, many years, but has recently been strengthened. This is an unusual organization in that it involves industry, government at various levels, and also non-government organizations to some extent. It tries to make reliability standards for electricity distribution. And the problem is, although it has had some effect through peer pressure, up until very recently it had no enforcement authority. In 2005, in August of 2005, a comprehensive energy bill was passed by the United States, NEPAC 2005, and it authorizes FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, to enforce against violators of reliability standards. Now, FERC obviously can't enforce in Canada. And so what FERC has done is negotiate individually with each province of Canada So that in this case, the enforcement of the regulatory standards will be at the provincial level, which is where I think under the Canadian arrangement it belongs. Point two. Electricity transmission infrastructure. I mentioned, perhaps too much in passing, that we have marvelous infrastructure for electricity, natural gas, and oil. I think Governor Richardson, who was seeking the vice presidency a few years ago, who's now seeking the presidency, has, in spite of the fact that he was Secretary of Energy, described the U.S. and North American electricity transmission network as that of a third world country. That's ridiculous. We have a very good one, but there are problems of congestion. And another aspect of this new legislation is to authorize the U.S. Department of Energy, because it only applies in the U.S., to examine transmission corridors and designate some as being so strangled by congestion problems that there need to be new transmission lines. Under those circumstances, once a corridor is designated, if the state utility, if the PUC fails to move along an application for transmission, which seems to be legitimate on its face and is being blocked not for good environmental reasons, but simply because of the selfishness of local utilities, FERC is allowed to step in. Now, the process is still in development. No national interest corridors have yet been named. There has been an examination by DOE. This is published. Everybody gets a chance to comment on it. But here is another case where the federal, regional, or state organizations have agreed to a process whereby, at the right moment, there can be federal intervention. That was a comment, rather than the questions.
Thank you.
Scott Greenwood.
Sure, thanks. Thank you very much for the discussion. I enjoyed it very much. One thing I just wanted to amplify that Sigrid talked about and was alluded to is the role that traditional advocacy played in Devil's Lake in getting it where it was. And I would just amplify or highlight that, there's a debate going on in Canada in the bureaucracy, it seems to me, about the traditional appropriate role of diplomacy. And examples like the great work on Devil's Lake should be heard and seen in Ottawa as a reason when you come to a place like the United States, you have to play ball the way it's played here, and not just think that you can be effective in the traditional exchange of diplomatic notes without engaging in the actual politics here. And I just highlight that because it's controversial in Ottawa. It's controversial within the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, and I think the more time you spend in the United States, the more you should know it shouldn't be controversial. It shouldn't be that controversial. The other thing I would say, just on Devil's Lake resolution, that is a kind of part of the story behind the story, is that in the White House, the person responsible for outreach to governors, the person in the West Wing with a senior job with the president, her previous job, who was very active behind the scenes in Devil's Lake because of the interest in the governor of North Dakota and the state federal role that was happening. Her previous job for 8 years had been heading up the Council of Great Lakes Governors, and so she understood the Boundary Water Treaty. Actually, she understood working with Canadian premiers in concert with governors, and that was part of the reason I think that the administration, while it wasn't perfect and had a lot of problems, was able actually to be slightly more rational on this than they have on some other issues. So I think there are a lot of factors on both sides that actually helped in temporarily resolving what's a really tricky and difficult issue.
I'll just make one comment, and that is that the Devil's Lake campaign was, in fact, the largest advocacy campaign on any Canada-U.S. issue ever done. Mm-hmm. And we ramped up for that campaign very quickly, both at the recommendation of the State Department, also the fact that the North Dakota-funded outlet was going to start operating within a 3-month period. And if we were going to stop it, we had to do something fast. I came up with the overall strategy of what we should try and do, and by the time it was over, I had a 95-page spreadsheet that we updated every day of every approach we made to anybody in the U.S. or Canada to do some advocacy, and as we said before, the response was really quite astounding. Having completed that advocacy campaign, I think Ottawa was indeed reeling at what impact it had had, and I think still has not quite come to terms with whether we should replicate that campaign on other issues. Do you, if you go to the well too often, do you weaken the impact? And I guess there's some hesitation again, because you have to consider all issues in the Canada-US relationship. Was this the one that we should have gone to the well on? So those remain to be determined, but it was a very interesting first time.
If I could just say one quick word about this. For me, what actually first got me interested in U.S.-Canadian transboundary relations was a battle that most of you probably don't remember, although it's come back in another form, over Head Harbor Passage and the decision by the United States, at least initially, to try to build an oil refinery at Eastport, Maine. And in a paper I wrote a long time ago when Dave was a student of mine, I was essentially arguing that the Canadian federal government should have played a more decisive role in the U.S. regulatory process, because state officials were looking for some direction as to whether the Canadians would really be able to block passage of supertankers, and they weren't prepared to approve the project if the Canadians were going to say no. But the Canadians, and I interviewed a number of officials for what I understood to be good reasons, felt it was inappropriate for them on a diplomatic level to intervene in a state regulatory process. Now, one of the things I said afterwards, you shouldn't be afraid of that, and that, this is sort of, Americans are sort of prepared for that. But the other comment that I heard, and I understood it, was the reciprocity concern. There is the question of the extent to which we want American federal agencies operating in either federal Canadian or provincial Canadian politics, and we recognize the danger if we open up this border too much. So I'm sympathetic to that argument, even though, again, I think then and in other cases, a clear expression of Canadian interest is a good thing rather than a bad.
David Ireland. Professor Springer, my question pertains to your comment that you made about the need for a joint impact assessment. Siggy provided a succinct overview of the various bilateral issues facing us, and yesterday we heard the term "eye in the storm," and perhaps now with Devil's Lake behind us somewhat, we can take a breath and look forward to how we're going to tackle bilateral issues in a more proactive manner. Siggy rightly pointed out the need for dispassionate analysis based on sound scientific understanding. What then are your thoughts as to the proper mechanism or mechanisms for such a joint impact assessment?
To be entirely honest, it's an idea that I threw out that came out toward the end of looking at the whole problem, and it was one of Cheryl Rosenberg, or somebody who's actually suggested this. Again, looking for something short of what we try to think of as the more traditional forms of diplomatic interaction through arbitration, looking for what I think she quite honestly argued was the central problem. It was assessment not just of damage, but of risk of damage, where it's one thing where you can have a fairly clear sort of cost-benefit analysis and try to work out what some remedial measures ought to be. But when there is a perception on one side that even the slightest introduction of one species or parasite across the border could happen, and what we're really talking about is levels of precaution to take, the suggestion is we need a dialogue, and I think her suggestion was at more of an expert level, to try to some extent to depoliticize this, not to be a kind of determinative body in the way some of our impact assessments are used, but either as an advisory process to the ICJ or something maybe side to that might be helpful in doing it. And again, one of the dangers in working with any case studies is trying to create institutions based on what you see as the problem in one situation, and whether the energy devoted to creating something as broad as a joint impact assessment process would be worth it, I don't know. But I do think it's one of those ideas that looks to me like a kind of intermediary way of trying to deal with some of these issues without going to broad new bilateral institutions.
Éric Duchesne, Université Laval. I found extremely interesting what you said about advocacy group and case of Devil's Lake, because one of the things I really didn't get into yesterday when I talk about the softwood lumber dispute is I think there was somewhere where the Canadian strategy was lacking, was reaching out to American groups. I'm talking especially, in the construction industry that should have been, not say pressure, but at least getting some help, educated. Yeah, I think that's the right term, because I was thinking about this in terms of what those of us in academia who are interested in international negotiation is looking at it in what we call in a two-level analysis, where there are two negotiations going on. There's domestic negotiation and there's international negotiation, but they're related. And one way they're related is what we call reverberations. That's what you just described. And I think I understand, but I'm absolutely sure. You almost feel like you're ashamed that it works so well, and then the government said, we don't want to use this tactic anymore because there are some political costs to be paid for it because it works so well. So I find this angle extremely interesting, and I wonder maybe that's what's connected, why it wasn't used as much as a researcher I would have liked to see used in the softwood lumber case. That's the first. The second issue, completely unrelated. That's not, but very quickly. Something else I'm interested in the near future is the Northwest Passage. There's another conflict that's looming on the horizon, and I can understand the political ramifications, but I wonder, is that something else that's going to become an environmental issue as well? In terms of so I'm going to throw that question to both of you.
I'll just quickly answer your first comment about perhaps how I came across feeling for projecting a bit of shame that the campaign had such phenomenal success, and I attribute that to being a Canadian and our propensity to be very modest and have very low expectations. So it definitely was much more effective than anybody dreamed it would be, and I think part of the reason we had such support when we came up with the idea in Ottawa at the Privy Council office and the Prime Minister's office was that they probably didn't really expect it to go anywhere. And when it did, they were faced with the fact that should we have used this campaign earlier on this type of campaign on softwood or other issues? When is it appropriate to apply this kind of a campaign? How often do you want to do it with the same people? Because if you're targeting senators and representatives and governors and industry, and business councils and NGOs and everybody, you can only go to them so many times. On the Arctic sovereignty issue, or the probable, the very likely, the opening of the Northwest Passage year-round due to climate change, it's certainly something that I know both the Canadian and the U.S. governments are looking at now at the federal level. The obvious implication being that if transport vessels are going through on a regular basis, you need to make sure that they are following regulations on in terms of what kind of vessels they are. Are they double hulled? If they hit an iceberg, what if they leak oil? What impact does that have on the wildlife? Who has the right to pass? So who's going to monitor that? Does Canada have the resources? It's certainly a looming issue.
Can I intervene? I'm surprised that you were surprised at your success, because after all, the advocacy anti-James Bay hydro in the Northeast, 10 years ago or whatever it was very successful. And so
I think it was the bilateral context. Could a couple of Canadians wandering into people's offices and saying, I have this issue that you might actually find has local implications for you, even if you're not concerned about the impact of Devil's Lake because you're a representative from Texas, you might want to think about it in terms of transboundary water issues to do with your constituency in Mexico. And that had phenomenal resonance. And
And if I could just build on that, on the other side, I think there were an awful lot of Americans, given sort of national environmental policies in the United States during this period, who were very frustrated about the relative lack of interest in the environment at the federal level. And so I think that's one of the reasons why states and local organizations have become increasingly active, even in dealings with issues like Kyoto and other things that one would normally think to be the province of the national government. So there were coalitions to be built out there, and the Citizens to Save the Cheyenne were very happy to work with Manitoba counterparts, and there is a dynamic there that I think, again, from an American perspective, increasingly makes sense. I know that there are some Canadians who worry a little bit too much about having American NGOs happily crossing the border and forming coalitions when some of those issues may later be, from a reciprocity standpoint, ones directed at Canada rather than directed at the United States.
David.
This goes to you talk about federalism and how things are addressed federally, but I guess a question for Siggy and then for Allan. How many of these issues on the border that you mentioned are really looked at as national? Because it seems to me that Devil's Lake, although it was a regional issue, Manitoba, North Dakota, in the United States remained a totally regional issue. It was a North Dakota thing, but in Canada it became more of a national emotional thing, along the line with softwood, that it was another one of those things that those Americans were after us on, but it didn't have the national resonance here. Are there other issues that are more national in Canada and less so here? I'm just wondering if that has any implication on how things are received.
In terms of can you specifically identify current issues that have national resonance in Canada, probably the only one that's readily recognizable is the Arctic Refuge. But the reason that one would have the national or federal oversight of any regional environmental issue is simply that so often the basis on which there might be concern is in fact the Boundary Waters Treaty as a prime example. And even though it may be a very local issue such as the current Teck-Cominco slag issue between British Columbia and Washington State and the First Nations who live around Lake Roosevelt, the Boundary Water Treaty, which is a bilateral treaty, still applies. And even if we don't choose to evoke that at this time for various reasons, that's the framework within which we always work. And I think the fact that Devil's Lake gained national attention when it did pretty much had to do with the political situation in Canada at the time and the propensity to try and identify, we were heading into elections and, part of the campaign was anti-Americanism, and it was something that was happening that people could also identify with. I'm not sure if we hadn't been in that situation, anybody in Canada other than in Manitoba would have heard or cared about it. Nobody would have been interviewed.
I just jump in again? It's interesting because, of course, the ANWR, the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge issue, is seen as a national issue in the United States, and Republican and development forces in Alaska are extraordinarily resentful of the fact that it's seen as a national, and that the U.S. Congress has the deciding authority. Those people are like a hornet's nest of anger about the fact that Alaska isn't able to make the decisions itself. Of course, the rest of us are delighted that that's the case and breathe easier with the change in the Congress.
Well, if I could just add, there's an irony there in that one of the Republican senators who supported restrictions on drilling is Susan Collins from Maine, who is also very concerned that the issue of liquefied natural gas distribution and coming into the states might become a national issue, when in fact we're very concerned about protecting the Maine coast from these things coming in, or at least some people are. So that it's, off again, it depends very much on the issue and the angle from which you see it.
Yes, John Ibbotson.
If I could make this much more simplistic, even journalistic perhaps, I spent some time out at Devil's Lake, and it was perfectly clear that it was a domestic political issue that trumped all other domestic political issues. The lake was flooding badly. It was literally wiping out subdivisions. And any governor who wanted to get reelected or perhaps go to the Senate was going to fix Devil's Lake, come hell or high water. And so it's a horrifically complex issue. But when you strip it all down, it comes down to the fact that a governor, for domestic political reasons, compelling domestic political reasons, decided to dig a ditch and to hell with what Washington said. And Washington was extremely, for political and constitutional reasons, constrained in its ability to order the state to stop doing it. And all the entreaties of the Canadian government and the lobbying couldn't stop it from happening. So eventually they cobbled together a face-saving agreement and a fake screen to make it look as though something had been done, and therefore the architecture, the superstructure could be preserved. But in fact, the governor just dug the ditch and no one could stop him. So in the future, especially if you believe that water scarcity is going to become an increasingly compelling issue in the Midwest and elsewhere, what we have here is I would contend, not a compromise, not an agreement. We have a very dangerous precedent. And both on the Canadian side and on the American side, the question is, given constitutional limitations and given political limitations, what are we going to do over the next decade or 20 years if governors and premiers decide to just do things with large binational issues and large border issues, and we don't yet at the moment have political or constitutional mechanisms in place to stop them? I mean, how are we going to handle the next Devil's Lake if another premier or governor just decides to do it?
I wish I had an answer. I mean, I think as I say in the paper, I think in the long term, we've got to create those at least those expectations of earlier confrontation with these issues at the federal level. In the short run, there's not a great deal that can be done. A lot of it is a matter of political will. I mean, there is pressure that the U.S. federal government can bring to bear if its environmental priorities are high enough. Now, in this case, because of the funding issue, the real problem became as soon as the state was able to fund something else on their own. To the extent that this was going to be a federally funded project, we did have the ability to stop it. What is remarkable, if you look at that correspondence, as the state is digging the ditch, it's not entirely clear that the State Department even knows that the ditch is being dug. The Secretary of State is giving assurances to the Canadians that we're not going to do anything that will endanger Canadian interests. They're looking over the border and seeing the bulldozers digging this thing. It seems to me that the fact that there was ultimately some agreement cobbled together indicated enough sensitivity, particularly, I think, on domestic political constituencies in the United States. The folks in Minnesota were not happy, and there were people in North Dakota who weren't happy. That there was an agreement that might have been reached earlier, particularly with the advanced filtration system that I think a lot of Canadians would have felt much better seeing in place from the very beginning, that had this been confronted earlier in a way that there was no incentive on the part of the governor of North Dakota to do, but even on a political level, had we confronted it and talked about that earlier, I mean, as expensive as it was, we were still talking about essentially a $20 billion filtration system. I think it was possible to deal with that earlier. And whether it begins by starting an impact assessment back earlier, when it appears that even North Dakota was prepared to talk about this in 2001, and not waiting until it was so late in the process that then literally the ditch was being dug and you had no choice but to accommodate it. To me, it's earlier, and when I put in the title here, effective federal involvement, I'm not exactly sure what that means, and it probably means different things in different contexts.
With that, I think I would like to thank Allan Springer and Sigrid Johnson for a most stimulating session. And say that with that, we come to the end of this authors' conference on the state of the Canada-US relationship. I would like, on behalf of the Association for Canadian Studies in the U.S., to thank the Woodrow Wilson International Center and David Biet for being the host for this very stimulating event. I'd like to thank all of the authors and all of the discussants whose work resulted in stimulating discussion and which will, I hope, contribute to an excellent volume of the American Review of Canadian Studies. And also thank you to all of the participants and to the other co-editor, Monroe Eagles. Thank you all very much for being here.
Oh, you're welcome.
I will.